and welcome to another thrilling episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and today we're continuing our festive outlook as we're looking to talk about and think about what is no doubt on your minds and probably more so on your children's minds or grandchildren's mind. And we're going to talk about the one and only, the jolly man, old Saint Nick, or Saint Nicholas, as many folks call him around. So, Ken, you're an avid Santa fan. I know that you have a full Santa costume, and one of your things that you do is you moonlight as a mall Santa, and so I know this is very close to your heart. Jolly is one. I always think of Jolly and Ken Fish together, and so I know this is very, very near and dear to your heart. So, Ken, talk to us about your alter ego, Saint Nicholas.
Well, first, before we get going, we should probably disabuse people of that notion, because there'll be some part of our listeners that will be offended and probably stalk away.
I'm joking.
Yeah. Grant, you work in the business world. You're also a pastor, but you have a history as a banker before you were called to the ministry. Before we start, you know the term clawback, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell people what a clawback is.
I don't know where this is going, but essentially it's a part of a contract where you can claw back some of the money if the value isn't there. Is that essentially what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's right. And so really, this is the third of three podcasts we've made now that's part of the attempt to claw back the Christian holidays from what they have become. So they're proving to be less than they were. And because of that, we want to claw back and take our holidays back. And so with that, we're going to talk today about what the one who is commonly called Santa Claus, but we're going to call him by his proper name, and his name is Saint Nicholas of Myra, which is a city in Turkey. And so the true story of Santa Claus begins with Saint Nicholas, and he was born in the 3rd century. Now, for a lot of our listeners, they wouldn't have any sense of what that means, but just keep in mind right now, at this moment, as we're making this broadcast, we are in the 21st century, but the years start with 20 or the number 20. So the century that it is designated is always one higher than what the number would indicate. So if he lived in the 3rd century, it would have been the 200s AD. So this is relatively close to the time of Jesus, at least by our standards. And he's roughly 10 times closer to Jesus than we are. And he was born in a village in Asia Minor. We know its name. Its name was Patara. But anyway, at the time, this whole area was Greek. And today it's now part of Turkey, on the southwest coast of Turkey. So if you think of where approximately, just to give you a sense of geography, where Turkey juts out into the Aegean Sea, and you think of the kind of southwestern corner jutting into the sea, you'd be more or less in the area of Ephesus, although not properly in Ephesus. And St. Nicholas was born into a very wealthy family, a devout Christian family, and so they raised him to be a believer. Now, keep in mind that this was going on in the era where persecution was still a very real thing in the Roman Empire. But persecution tended to be episodic. It would kind of get bad. People would die. They'd be imprisoned. They'd lose their homes, their lands, their children. And then the government would let up, and it would be better for a while. And then there'd be another one. In fact, between the death of Jesus, we'll say in 30 AD, people might say as late as 33, and the Council of Nicaea in 325, well, that's about 295 years, or maybe 292 years. Somewhere in that roughly 300-year period, there were 10 major persecutions that occurred. So this is still during that era where it is not always safe to be a Christian. But anyway, he was raised as a devout believer. And interestingly, his parents died in a plague. There was an epidemic that broke out, and Nicholas was still a young man, devout young man. when his parents died. And of course, then he inherited their considerable wealth. But because he was a devout Christian, and you never hear stories like this anymore, by the way, he obeyed Jesus' words to sell what you own and give the money to the poor. And so he took his entire inheritance and used it to assist the needy, the sick, and the suffering. And then he dedicated his life to serving God. And while he was still very young, he became the Bishop of Myra in Turkey. And so he became known throughout the land for his generosity to those in need, for his love for children, and in particular, because of his upbringing on the southwestern coast of Turkey, right on the Aegean Sea, his particular and unique concern for sailors and their ships. And so he is in some ways viewed as a sort of a patron saint of those who go to sea. Now, during the reign of Diocletian, who had one of the worst persecutions that ever came about, he was particularly vicious in his persecution of Christians. Bishop Nicholas was arrested, and he was exiled and imprisoned, and he became what we call a confessor. Now, for people who don't know the language of church history, there are martyrs and there are confessors. And I think most people at least know the term martyr. A martyr is somebody who lays down their life for the faith. A confessor is someone who suffers for the faith. And generally, sorry, I thought I'd turned off the phone. Generally, a confessor is somebody who, as Paul says, bears in their body the marks of the Lord Jesus. So many of the early confessors, maybe they limped because they'd had a leg broken or their knee was damaged, or maybe they were put on a rack and their body was stretched and it never really returned to its normal geometry. They may have had numbness or tingling or partial paralysis. Some of them had their tongues cut out, their eyes gouged out, maybe their ears cut off, their nose cut off. So they escaped with their life, but it's not always clear, at least by our standards of the modern day, that we would have thought that, escaping death was better than death itself. And so Bishop Nicholas was a confessor. So he wasn't a martyr, but he was a confessor. And he was ultimately exiled and then held in prison. But at the time, the prisons were full of bishops and priests and deacons. Now, again, you have to understand the structure of the church in those years. If you come out of a Protestant background, you would not particularly understand this. But within the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, which in that era, they were one and the same, within the Orthodox and the Catholic churches, the deacons were they're ordained, but they're the lowest level of ordination, and they're not yet allowed to celebrate communion. They're not allowed to perform some of the other rites of the church. Priests, of course, those are fully ordained people, and the bishops are people who lead what's called a diocese, or if it's an archbishop, then an archdiocese, which is simply a bigger diocese. Bishops ordain priests, and they govern the affairs of that larger ecclesiastical territory. So the prisons are chock-a-block full of bishops, priests, and deacons because of Diocletian's persecution, and there's no room for the real criminals, the murderers, the thieves, and the robbers. And, we could think for just a moment, I would say, about our own times in which people who are people of faith are often made to bear a burden for something, whereas maybe those who have actually committed actual crimes are being turned loose, allowed to go free. There's some similarity here, and I'm not trying to stir up passions and sentiments. I'm not trying to, make everybody mad at the government. I'm just saying this is not the first time we've seen this. This is not the first rodeo for the Christian church. And so with that, one of the things we can learn right away from Saint Nicholas is that if we bear persecution for the name of Jesus, we should bear it with dignity and with honor, and we should count ourselves worthy of having been counted, worthy of suffering for the name. Peter speaks of this in his letter, and of course, Jesus even says that when you are dragged before governors and kings and so forth, you should celebrate and rejoice that you've been counted worthy to suffer for the name. I think particularly in the Western world, most particularly in the United States, but it's been going on to various degrees in Western Europe. Canada, Australia, New Zealand. A lot of Christians are rising up and saying, it reminds me of the movie Network. We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. Well, on the one hand, we shouldn't have to take it because we do have civic rights that they didn't have in St. Nicholas's period. But remember that our highest calling is to give honor to Jesus at all times. And it even says that we should honor those who persecute us if they are the rulers of our lands. That doesn't mean we have to like what they're doing. Doesn't mean we have to go along and bless what they're doing. But nevertheless, we have to suffer as he suffered, opening not his mouth and returning not slander for slander.
Yeah, and if there's one thing we're not known for in America is suffering well and
Right.
And keeping our mouths shut. So, good point.
Well, okay, so eventually Diocletian's persecution ends. Diocletian dies, and Nicholas ends up attending as one of the bishops of the entire world the Council of Nicaea, which was held in the year 325 AD. Now, a little bit of background here. Constantine had been converted right after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and he issued an edict of toleration in 313, which made Christianity licit, and not only licit, but the actual religion of the whole Roman Empire. That's the year 313. So if Jesus was persecuted, if Jesus was crucified in the year 33 AD, it's 280 years after Jesus's death. And I just want to stop for a second to give everybody a sense of perspective on that. How long is 280 years? I mean, on the one hand, you could say that's a long time, or you could say, well, it's nothing. It was really close to Jesus's life and death. Well, 280 years is longer than the United States has been a country, just to put it in perspective.
Right.
And so, you could drop the whole history of the United States into this interval before Constantine is converted. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge happened in 312, and Constantine had actually seen a sign in the heavens, and it was written in Latin, and the Latin inscription that he saw in the heavens was in hoc signo vinces, which means in Latin, in this sign you will conquer. And he'd seen a cross in the sky, and so he instructed all of his soldiers to take chalk or whatever they could find and mark a cross on their shields so that they would go to battle with the cross before them. This might actually be, I mean, it's a little bit apocryphal, but it's possible. This is where we get the line from the song, "The cross before me, the world behind me." So Constantine went into battle at the Milvian Bridge. He defeated the other armies. He becomes the emperor. He issues the Edict of Toleration. And it's about 12 years later that he summons a council in Nicaea, not far from where Nicholas was raised. It's on the coast of Turkey. And part of it is to settle what becomes known as the Arian heresy. Now, Arius was a presbyter who lived in Turkey, and he taught that there was a time that Jesus didn't exist. He was a created being. He might have been the first created of all creatures, but he was a creature. And the Orthodox formulation dealing with Jesus was that he was not created. He was eternally coexistent with the Father. And as the Nicene Creed goes, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Through him all things were made. So that's the Nicene formulation of our understanding of Jesus, and it remains the Orthodox understanding to this day. I think you can easily document that from the pages of the New Testament, but you know how these things go. There's always somebody who wants to kind of read it a little differently. And so he attended the Council of Nicaea, as you might expect, since he is Saint Nicholas. He clearly held with the side of orthodoxy. And Saint Nicholas is also known as a saint because of the many miracles that he wrought. We'll talk about some of those in a minute. But anyway, he died on the 6th of December in the year 343 in his town of Myra. He was buried in the church, the cathedral church, where he was the presiding bishop and pastor. And when he was buried, there was a unique relic that formed in his grave. And this relic became known as manna. It is specifically named after the manna of the Old Testament that the Jews ate when they were coming out of Egypt. But in fact, in the case of Saint Nicholas, the manna was not white and flaky like a coriander seed, as the book of Exodus tells us. It was liquid, and it was said to have healing powers. And so there was a growth in the sort of the cult of Saint Nicholas, as was not rare in those days. I wouldn't say it was universal, but it was not rare, even as early as now in the 4th century, 343. Again, remembering what I said, that the name on the century will be one higher than the first digits of the century we're describing. So 343 becomes the mid 4th century. And remember, he'd been a young boy when his parents had died. And so this is entirely believable that he would be alive at this time, given that he was so young when he came into his money and gave it away. And so anyway, this liquid substance was said to have healing powers. And as you might expect, people took it away and they smeared it on their friends and family. And there were many reported healings that came about because of this manna that emerged at St. Nicholas's grave. I know there'll be some listeners that will really struggle with this, but I just want to say this is an example of some of the miraculous lore of the church that really goes through the first 1,000+ years of Christianity. It's very different from a Protestant sentiment, but remember, we're talking about a time when Orthodoxy and Catholicism are one, and we're also talking about a time in which the very expression of Christianity was very different from what modern Protestantism, Pentecostalism, NAR, Revival Alliance, Vineyard, any of those kinds of streams of the church, they just don't do church that way. And so it turns out that the anniversary of his death, again, the 6th of December, becomes a feast day, and it becomes known as Saint Nicholas's Day or Saint Nicholas Day. When Julian reforms the calendar a couple of centuries later, the feast day of Saint Nicholas moves to December the 19th. And then we get the procession, which is the wobbling on its axis of the earth. And it hasn't been all of 2,000 years since his death. It's been more like 1,700 years. But that procession has caused the date to move later and later on the calendar. And so St. Nicholas becomes identified with Santa Claus. And if you look at the iconography of St. Nicholas, of course, he's always shown with a mitre, which is the bishop's hat, but he also has a white flowing beard along the lines of St. Nicholas. And because he was a bishop, there would have been certain seasons of the year where he dressed in red. And so this becomes the kind of foundational idea behind Santa Claus. Now, there have been a lot of stories about St. Nicholas through the years. Some of this can be difficult to substantiate, and I want to say that up front. But I also want to say equally quickly that not all of it is difficult to substantiate, because within the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, they have a very rigorous methodology for vetting claims of miracles that are associated with specific people. And in order for someone to be made a saint, they need to have performed at least one confirmed miracle during their lifetime, and then another one after their death that happened as a result of somebody either using a relic or praying to the saint or something. And again, for Protestants, this is really foreign. I know it's bending your mind into pretzels. I'm just telling you as a historian the way they view it in these ecclesiastical and liturgical traditions of the church. So through the centuries, there have been these various stories that have emerged of miracles associated with St. Nicholas, and they help us understand who he was, why he was beloved, and why he was viewed as a protector of those in need. So one story that comes to us from antiquity, from the time of St. Nicholas himself, tells of a poor man who had 3 daughters. And in those days, in order for a young woman to get married, she had to have something of value, also known as a dowry. And then the father would give the dowry to the suitor. And of course, as you might expect, the more money that was in the dowry, or the more items of value, didn't have to be money. It could be cows, it could be gemstones, it could be, any number of things, lands, but whatever. The larger the dowry, the better the chance that the woman would find a good husband, at least one who had some money himself. And this is, by the way, one of the means by which wealth was perpetuated within families. And I know for a lot of people, that's a trigger thing right there. And they're going to want to go down the path of, discrimination and how the poor are always oppressed and, race. And I don't want to talk about any of that. We're talking about Saint Nicholas. Problem is here, these women needed dowries, and they're all from a poor man who can't provide them. And so a woman without a dowry was unlikely to marry. She might be sold into slavery, which could mean prostitution, or it may mean just a working class existence where she had nothing. So this man's daughters without dowries were, they didn't have a very good future. It was very bleak. But notwithstanding, on 3 different occasions, very mysteriously, a bag of gold appeared in their home, and it provided first 1, then 2, and finally 3 dowries. And all of the bags of gold, as it works out, were tossed through an open window. And the tradition tells us that they landed in stockings or on the shoes that were left by the fire to dry. And so this is where we get our custom of children hanging stockings or putting out their shoes. That's particularly common in Scandinavian countries, awaiting gifts to come from Saint Nicholas. And sometimes the story is told that there were gold balls rather than bars of gold, but the point is there was gold. And so sometimes, depending on your tradition, again, this is more common in Northern Europe, but sometimes in some families that practice this, they put out gold-colored balls, often represented by oranges, which are not exactly gold, but they're kind of trending that way. These are symbols of Saint Nicholas, and so Saint Nicholas is seen as a gift giver. Here's another story of Saint Nicholas, that he was a protector of children, but it took place after his death. So the townspeople of Myra were celebrating the saint on the eve of his feast day. So we already know his feast day. It's December the 6th on the old calendar, December the 19th on the Julian. We're not sure which calendar we're counting by, but it's that day. And it turns out that a band of pirates, Arab pirates, who had sailed across the Aegean Sea from the island of Crete, they landed and they came into the district, and they were kind of doing what pirates do. Now, it wasn't a big enough group of pirates to take over the town the way maybe you see at Pirates of the Caribbean, but they stole treasures from the Church of Saint Nicholas, which previously had been known as the Cathedral of Saint Myra, and they were going to take all this away as booty, as pirates' treasure. And as they were leaving town, they snatched a young boy. His name was Basilios. Now, that's interesting, Basilios, right there. I mean, I think there's something prophetic in this, because Basileia is the word for kingdom in Greek. And of course, this is a Greek-speaking area. So Basilios means something like the kingdom, or the dome over a cathedral was known as the basilica. And so Basilios was probably some kind of a Christian boy, and he had been dedicated to either the service in the cathedral or the purposes of the kingdom of God, to the extent people understood what the kingdom was at this date. And they intended to turn him into a slave. And so the leader of these pirates, the emir, or the ruler, he selected Basilios to be his personal cupbearer, because Basilios didn't speak the language of the Arabs, and so he wouldn't understand what was going on around him, and he wouldn't be able to, pass that information along. So anyway, for the next year, Basilios waited on the king. He brought his wine to him in a golden goblet. But of course, Basilios's parents were, they were grieving the loss of their only child, and the year went by for them very slowly. But as the next feast of Saint Nicholas approached, Basilios's mother refused to join in the festivity because this was a day of mourning for her. She'd lost her boy. And she was persuaded, nevertheless, to have a simple observance at home with quiet prayers for Basilios's safekeeping. Now, remember, this is in a time where there's no mass communication. There's no Twitter. There's no texting. Basilios couldn't just be on his text stream saying, "Hey, Mom, don't worry about me. I'm good. The emir's treating me well." I mean, there was none of that. She hadn't heard from him. He's vanished. So they're praying, I would say, very much in faith for his safekeeping. They literally don't know what's happened to this boy. He could be dead. He could have been turned into what today in maybe other lands they call a dancing boy or a soft boy. meaning he would have been subjected to pederasty on the part of the emir. I mean, anything could have been going on. But anyway, Basilios was fulfilling his tasks, waiting on the emir, and suddenly he was snatched away. And by this, I mean literally whisked up in the air and woof, gone. And Saint Nicholas appears to the terrified boy and blesses him and sets him down at his home back in Myra. Now, again, for some, this is an extraordinary tale, and they say this is symptomatic of the mythology and all of the legend and just craziness of the early Middle Ages. But in fact, these kinds of stories are so common in early church history that I really think it stretches credibility to write all of them off. It really shows the imperialism of the modern mind and of the thrust on modernity, and even today, postmodernism with which we live. It shows all of that far more than it calls into question the legitimacy of these stories, because while not identical, this has things about it that sound very much like, well, Elijah being snatched up and carried away in the Old Testament, or what happened to Philip the evangelist in the book of Acts. So, of course, joy and celebration and wonderment break out when Basilios is suddenly right before his parents, still holding the king's cup.
Wow.
And so this is one of the first stories of St. Nicholas protecting children, which becomes his primary role in the West. Now, remember that he gave dowries to 3 young women. I guess this could have been a little bit left over from his own wealth, maybe, or maybe he got the money somewhere else out of the cathedral treasury or something. That's a possibility. Certainly the habit, and has been the habit for centuries, for bishops to go into the treasury of the cathedral that they oversee, and from time to time open that treasury and give alms to the poor. This thing with the young women would have been a form of alms to the poor. And then, of course, we have this boy, and he's returned with this golden goblet. And again, it's a miracle of transportation, but it just shows you something of the world in which the ancient Christians lived and believed. And I think there's another takeaway for us in the story of St. Nicholas, that we should be challenged to expect the miraculous, and maybe to say expect the unexpected, to live in the realm of God's abundant and surprising intervention in our lives. I think all of these things come away from the story of St. Nicholas. Now, here's another one. This is an interesting one. There were 3 young students, presumably young men, because they were theological students, and they were going on their way to Athens to study. And there was an innkeeper who, ran an inn, a hotel, and they stopped for the night, and he robbed them and murdered them. And he hid their remains in a tub that was used for the making of pickles, a pickling tub. And so, this is kind of in the realm of Jeffrey Dahmer type stuff, right? So we know this sort of thing went on. I mean, this is just the nature of fallen humanity. I'm not giving it a pass. I'm just saying we shouldn't be shocked that these things went on 1700 years ago, because they're going on in our time too. So anyway, Bishop Nicholas is traveling along the same route, and what do you know? He stops at the same inn, and in the night he has a dream of the crime. So we could call this a prophetic word. The histories don't call it that, but that's the way we would characterize it today. So he gets up and he summons the innkeeper, and the innkeeper admits to what has happened, and Nicholas then prays earnestly to the Father, to God, that the 3 boys would be restored to life and wholeness. Now, remember, we're talking about a dismemberment here. This is not merely raising the dead.
Right.
Well, anyway, in France, the story is told of 3 small children who wandered in their play until they were lost. They were lured and captured by an evil butcher. Same idea. And St. Nicholas appears and appeals to God to return them to life and their families. And so St. Nicholas becomes the patron and the protector of children. Now, let me just pause here for a second, because there'll be some that'll be like, come on, Ken, give me a break. So I just want to drop one name in front of you. And this individual is known for raising the dead. He's had, as I remember it now, the last number I heard, more than 95 people raised from the dead on his watch, and he often ministers in southern Mexico. At one point, he had gone to a village where, as they came up on the village, wandering through the forested mountains, there were a number of bodies laying outside the village because of the drug wars. And each of those bodies had had the heads severed. And the bodies were laying one way and the heads the other. And so anyway, it was a pretty sickening sight. And even this man, whose name is David Hogan, some of you would know his name, even he couldn't look at it. So they went into the village and they got a tarp and they laid the bodies out side by side, and with guidance from the villagers to make sure they had the right head with the right body, they laid the heads next to the bodies, 9 heads, 9 bodies, and they covered the whole thing with a tarp. And then they prayed that God would raise them from the dead, and they went into the village to have lunch, which is, to me, a little bit strange that, after this kind of macabre situation, you go and have lunch. But anyway, this is what they did. So anyway, they come back from lunch, and, underneath the tarp, you can see that it's being bumped and pushed. And so they pull the tarp back. All 9 heads had reattached. All 9 people had been raised from the dead. So people say, well, that's a myth from the 3rd or 4th century. Well, not necessarily. Again, these things happen. They don't happen nearly enough, but they could happen more if we would take some lessons from this man that we've turned into Santa Claus. Well, here's another one. Saint Nicholas goes to sea, and when he was young, he wanted to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. He wanted to see where Jesus had walked. He wanted to experience Jesus's life and passion and resurrection. And as he's returning from the Holy Land to Turkey, a storm threatens to wreck the ship. And so Saint Nicholas prays. The sailors, of course, are sure they're going to die. So he prays, and the sea goes calm. The sailors are amazed. And again, you could say, well, this is absurd. Well, is it absurd? Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves in Mark chapter 4, and the sea died down. Now, Jesus rebuked, St. Nicholas prayed. I guess that's the difference between being the Son of God and merely being a devout holy man. But anyway, and then let's not forget the story of Jonah, that, he has a similar kind of storm, and he tells the sailors, throw me into the sea and everything will be fine. They do, and it is. Then here's another one. St. Nicholas saved his own people from famine. He spared the lives of those who had been accused of wrongdoing, who were actually innocent. And he did many kind and generous deeds in secret, expecting nothing in return. He would give gifts, maybe like the gold thrown through the window to the 3 young women that needed dowries. And so within a century of his death, he was understood as a saint. Today, he's venerated in the East as a wonder worker or a miracle worker. The technical Greek term is thaumaturgos, a worker of power, a worker of miracles. And in the West, he's a patron of, well, everybody wants him, right? The children, the mariners, bankers, pawnbrokers, scholars. Don't forget the theological students that were raised from the dead, orphans, laborers, travelers, merchants, marriageable maidens, not surprising. So there's all kinds of people who look to him. And again, he's often characterized with a very long white beard and wearing red robes. Sailors claim him as a special patron. There are chapels to St. Nicholas sprinkled around the Mediterranean. In France, you'll find various churches and chapels and shrines to him throughout Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, Russia, Prussia, the Netherlands. And actually, Grand Prince Vladimir I brought St. Nicholas's stories to the homeland of Russia, where he became the most beloved saint of all of Russia. And so he's so widely revered that thousands of churches have been named for him, including over 300 in Belgium, 34 in the city of Rome alone, and more than 400 throughout England. Now, today you can go to Myra, and his tomb is still there. It has become a popular place of pilgrimage. People go there to pray and commemorate his many noble and good deeds. Because of the many wars and so forth in the region that have come and gone through the years, sometimes getting to the tomb can be difficult. At this time, you can get there if you were of a mind to go. And in the spring of 1087, sailors from the city of Bari in Italy succeeded in taking away some of the bones and bringing them to southeastern Italy. And so now there's an impressive church over Saint Nicholas's bones, and many go there to honor him there, although that's not his original place. It was one of the great pilgrimage centers of the Middle Ages, and he became known as the saint in Bari, in the basilica in San Nicola. Now, through the centuries, Nicholas has continued to be honored, revered, venerated by Catholics and Orthodox, and even honored by Protestants. He's one of the few that everybody agrees on, maybe like, I don't know, Mary and Joseph or something. But his example of generosity to those in need, especially children, Nicholas continues to be a model for the compassionate life. And I might add, I read something in my alumni magazine not too long ago about a woman that was a student at my university. And she had been born into some money. And she had today we would call it a trust fund of about $4 million. She had been somehow made aware of some of the history of her family. And in her considered opinion, at her younger age, she decided that that money had been gained through improper means. And so she gave it all away because she thought it was tainted money, $4 million. Well, we don't know how much money St. Nicholas had. And I don't know all the ins and outs of this woman's story. I know what I read in the alumni magazine. And they had a couple of others that were featured who were similarly inclined, who had also given away trust funds that they had received. But, the thing that strikes me about Nicholas, and we don't do near enough talking about this in the modern church, and this is what I want to highlight, is Nicholas didn't have, he was young, and so you could say he was naive and didn't really appreciate what he had, but he had no particular qualms about taking his considerable wealth and distributing it, because Jesus had said, give what you have to the poor. And while I believe God wants to bless us, I also believe he blesses us so that we can bless others. It's not merely that we can pile it up. And so Nicholas had no problem with the idea of giving his money away, just like this woman from my university apparently had no trouble giving her money away. But I could ask, which is the more noble reason to give money away? Because you're following the instruction of the Lord Jesus as recorded in the Gospels, or because you came under some teaching that says that something unjust was done, and so you're going to give all of your money away. Either one could be viewed as good and right in the eyes of somebody. But for Christians who are thinking about Christmas, who are thinking about Saint Nicholas, I think we could actually do well to ponder a bit the wealth that we have, whether it's modest or great, and ask ourselves, what part of this might I want to distribute to those in need at this time of year? And do so in direct obedience to the commands of the Lord Jesus, because I assure you, in my entire life, I've never once heard a single sermon anywhere. And I've listened to many online recordings, whatever. I've listened to many that have come not just from my own pastor's mouth, but from other preachers who I was listening to today, we would say following. I've never heard a single one that challenges us to give away some of our wealth for the benefit of those who do not have it, or who need dowries, or who are, whatever their situation may be. And so St. Nicholas is still widely celebrated today in Europe. His feast day, the 6th of December, particularly in Eastern Europe, because they kind of dual track the calendar there. They keep alive the stories of his goodness and generosity. In Germany and Poland, boys will dress up as bishops. They'll ask for alms for the poor, sometimes for themselves. In the Netherlands and Belgium, St. Nicholas arrived on a steamship from Spain to ride on a white horse on his gift-giving rounds. So December the 6th is still the main day for gift-giving and merrymaking in much of Europe, roughly 3 weeks earlier than our Christmas Day. And so I really want to challenge everybody who's listening to this to ponder and meditate on the life of Saint Nicholas, Bishop of Myra. And I want to challenge you to think about, how could you in some way emulate his life this year, 2021, by giving something to somebody who is in need. And while I think charities are fine, I think you'll find that it will have more impact on you if you select somebody near to you and then do it without them knowing it. Find a way to do it in secret so that the right hand does not know what the left is doing. I think if you do this, you'll find a particular blessing will come to you. And I'm not saying it's financial this Christmas of 2021.
Oh, that's great. You know, I also know that he punched a heretic in the face at the Council of Nicaea. So I would say if you have to pick one to do, you would probably do better to give the money. But I mean, you know,
yeah, as you do, right?
Choice is yours.
Yeah. Well, you know, again, it was a different era. It was viewed that these sorts of things were not out of line. They were not inappropriate. Today, our sensibilities are different. Who's right? I mean, we think we're right because we're alive now and the dead can't really speak up. But what if we're wrong and Saint Nicholas was actually to be commended for his zeal for God? I mean, Elijah cut off the heads of 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah by the brook Kidron. You know, what do we do with that one?
Right. No, I'm not arguing with it, Ken.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we need it. Well, I think that's a pretty good lesson in redeeming, because there's so much talk about what we can and can't do or shouldn't do.
Right.
Around Christmas time, and I was talking to someone the other day, and they don't celebrate anything because of whatever. But I do think this is a great reminder that this is more than just what you think. And again, you know, we talked about this. When was it? I think it was on the Halloween episode. But this idea of honoring the saints, of honoring those that went before us. Yeah, it was Halloween, and commending that and lifting that up as an example. Is it First Peter where he's talking about Elijah was a man just like us.
Right.
And you know, Jesus sometimes seems like the impossible mentor, though he's not. But here's a man, Elijah, and we can at least esteem to that. Or here's a man, Saint Nicholas, and we can at least try and reach out to that. So I think it's a great call for us to start to live a little bit beyond maybe what we deem as normal.
You know, some years ago, I went on a ministry trip with John Wimber to England. And as part of it, our team, including my wife and me, we went to Stratford upon Avon, which is where William Shakespeare was from. We went into one of the churches in the town there on the high street, and it was a very old church. Remember that Shakespeare lived about 500 years ago, roughly. So this church was in existence in his day, and he would have attended that church. And when we went in, there was a plaque on the wall, and I took several pictures of it. I don't know what's become of those pictures now. No one was using smartphones in those days, so you couldn't just upload it to the cloud and then search for it by date. But anyway, I did take a picture of it, and I can no longer quote it from memory, but the gist of the plaque on the wall said, "This plaque is here to honor, you know, so-and-so of this town, a man of considerable wealth who made his money." Now I'm going from memory here. I think it was in the shoemaking trade, but whatever he was doing something. And, you know, it reminds me of the passage in Proverbs that says all work is meaningful. And with it, God can add to your wealth, no matter how menial it is, as long as you're consistent in it. So this man who is a shoemaker, if I have it right, had made considerable wealth over time. And it says that with that wealth, he endowed, lists the number of orphanages, and he cared for this many, you know, orphans through the ministry of those orphanages. He was, I can't remember, he started some schools, and he paid tuition for kids to go to school if they didn't go to the schools that he founded. And there were a number of things like this that this guy had been involved in from William Shakespeare's town of Stratford upon Avon. So it lists all this stuff out. And then at the bottom, it says, "Go thou and do likewise." Mm. And I really think that's really the challenge upon us. You know, sometimes people get wrapped up in the lives of the saints or their veneration or their worship. But at the end of the day, we are called to piety and to action.
Yeah.
It's not enough just to be pious. And by the way, it's not enough just to do good deeds without actually having a true, living, and vibrant faith. Because faith without works is dead, and so also works without faith is dead. So Saint Nicholas shows us what could be from somebody who is consecrated to the Lord, dedicated to him, who's willing to suffer for the Lord. He did when he was under Diocletian's persecution, and he never fully recovered from, we don't know exactly what became of his body, but he was somehow, disadvantaged or handicapped in all of that. And yet look at all that he accomplished for the Lord. And to this day, we still remember him. So we've tried to claw back a bit what Halloween was. We're clawing back what Christmas is. We did a claw back on Thanksgiving. All of this time of year for us in the West, we call them the holidays, but really that's just a shortened form of the word holy days. So here's another thought for you as we close out this podcast. Surely in the next few weeks, you're going to hear someone say to you somewhere, happy holidays. And you might turn and say, happy holy days. Which holy day do you celebrate? That could actually become the entrance to an evangelistic conversation. You could talk about the good deeds of Saint Nicholas and how he was mimicking Jesus. You could talk about Halloween and how it's the day before or the night before the holiest day of the Christian year, when we celebrate all the people who did good works in the name of Jesus because they believed in Jesus. We could talk about giving thanks to God because of his many blessings to us and his provision. We could go right down the list. And by the way, Monday, the 29th of November, was the first day of Hanukkah. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, not just a Christian tradition, we're in the holy days. Does anyone know what Hanukkah is? It's the day that in the year 165 BC, Matthias the Maccabee rededicated the temple to the Lord after it had been defiled by a Greek king who sacrificed a pig on the high altar. And so whether it's the rededication of the temple or these other things that we've talked about, all of them together show us that this time of year in particular is a time of reverence. It's a time of reflection. It should be a time of heightened devotion to the Lord, a time to take stock of how we've been living, that we might get ready to live, well, a good life in the next year, and presumably a better one than we led in this year. So with that, I'll stop. And Grant, if you want to add anything, otherwise I think I've said about all I need to say about Saint Nicholas.
I think we wrapped it. I love it. Ken, thank you so much. I know that I've heard so many things about from people about how they really enjoyed these clawback episodes. Santa Claus, maybe that's where that comes from. So we'll leave you on that bad joke, and we hope that you have a wonderful Feast of Saint Nicholas, which is coming up very shortly, and we'll see you right back here next week.
We've recently updated the Orbis Ministries app with Ken's free teaching archive. You can click on the link in the description of this podcast to download today.